Hey, do you want to hear a story? Today we'll be reading The Oval Portrait by Edgar Allan Poe. This is one of Poe's shortest stories, only a couple of pages long, so I plan on splitting this video up into two separate parts. For the first half, I'll just be narrating the plain text of Poe's story, and in the second half, I'll be talking about it. Nothing fancy, just an attempt to break it down a bit and understand what Poe might have been trying to say. If you've read the story recently, feel free to skip ahead straight to the analysis. Or if you're only here for Poe's words rather than mine, feel free to take your leave early. But if you're willing to hear both of us out, then thank you for taking the time to do so. And now, The Oval Portrait by Edgar Allan Poe. The chateau into which my valet had ventured to make forcible entrance, rather than permit me, in my desperately wounded condition, to pass a night in the open air, was one of those piles of commingled gloom and grandeur which have so long frowned among the Apennines, not less, in fact, than in the fancy of Mrs. Radcliffe. To all appearance, it had been temporarily and very lately abandoned. We established ourselves in one of the smallest and least sumptuously furnished apartments. It lay in a remote turret of the building. Its decorations were rich, yet tattered and antique. Its walls were hung with tapestry and bedecked with manifold and multiform armorial trophies, together with an unusually great number of very spirited modern paintings in frames of rich golden arabesque. In these paintings, which depended from the walls not only in their main surfaces, but in very many nooks which the bizarre architecture of the chateau rendered necessary, in these paintings my incipient delirium, perhaps, had caused me to take deep interest, so that I bade Pedro to close the heavy shutters of the room, since it was already night, to light the tongues of a tall candelabrum which stood by the head of my bed, and to throw open far and wide the fringed curtains of black velvet which enveloped the bed itself. I wished all this done that I might resign myself, if not to sleep, at least alternately to the contemplation of these pictures, and the perusal of a small volume which had been found upon the pillow, and which purported to criticize and describe them. Long I read, and devotedly I gazed. Rapidly and gloriously the hours flew by and the deep midnight came. The position of the candelabrum displeased me, and outreaching my hand with difficulty, rather than disturb my slumbering valet, I placed it so as to throw its rays more fully upon the book. But the action produced an effect altogether unanticipated. The rays of the numerous candles, for there were many, now fell within a niche of the room which had hitherto been thrown into deep shade by one of the bedposts. I thus saw in vivid light a picture all unnoticed before. It was the portrait of a young girl just ripening into womanhood. I glanced at the painting hurriedly, and then closed my eyes. Why I did this was not at first apparent, even to my own perception. But while my lids remained thus shut, I ran over in my mind my reason for so shutting them. It was an impulsive moment to gain time for thought, to make sure that my vision had not deceived me, to calm and subdue my fancy for a more sober and more certain gaze. In a very few moments, I again looked fixedly at the painting. That I now saw aright I could not and would not doubt, for the first flashing of the candles upon that canvas had seemed to dissipate the dreamy stupor which was stealing over my senses, and to startle me at once into waking life. The portrait, I have already said, was that of a young girl. It was a mere head and shoulders, done in what is technically termed a vignette manner, much in the style of the favorite heads of Sully. The arms, the bosom, and even the ends of radiant hair melted imperceptibly into the vague yet deep shadow which formed the background of the whole. The frame was oval, richly gilded, and filigreed and moresque. As a thing of art, nothing could be more admirable than the painting itself. But it could have been neither the execution of the work nor the immortal beauty of the countenance, which had so suddenly and so vehemently moved me. Least of all could it have been that my fancy, shaken from its half-slumber, had mistaken the head for that of a living person. I saw at once the peculiarities of the design, of the vignetting, and of the frame must have instantly dispelled such an idea, must have prevented even its momentary entertainment. Thinking earnestly upon these points, I remained, for an hour perhaps, half sitting, half reclining, with my vision riveted upon the portrait. At length, satisfied with the true secret of its effect, I fell back within the bed. I had found the spell of the picture in an absolute lifelikeliness of expression, which at first startling, finally confounded, subdued, and appalled me. With deep and reverent awe, I replaced the candelabrum in its former position. The cause of my deep agitation being thus shut from view, I sought eagerly the volume which discussed the paintings and their histories. Turning to the number which designated the oval portrait, I there read the vague and quaint words which follow. She was a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee. And evil was the hour when she saw, and loved, and wedded the painter. He, passionate, studious, austere, and having already a bride in his art. She, a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee. All light and smiles, and frolicsome as the young fawn, loving and cherishing all things, hating only the art which was her rival, dreading only the palette and brushes and other untoward instruments which deprived her of the countenance of her lover. It was thus a terrible thing for this lady to hear the painter speak of his desire to portray even his young bride. But she was humble and obedient, and sat meekly for many weeks in the dark, high-turret chamber where the light dripped upon the pale canvas only from overhead. But he, the painter, took glory in his work, which went on from hour to hour and from day to day. And he was a passionate and wild and moody man who became lost in reveries, so that he would not see that the light which fell so ghastly in that lone turret withered the health and the spirits of the bride, who pined visibly to all but him. Yet she smiled on, and still on, uncomplainingly, because she saw that the painter, who had high renown, took a fervid and burning pleasure in his task, and wrought day and night to depict her who so loved him, yet who grew daily more dispirited and weak. And in sooth, some who beheld the portrait spoke of its resemblance in low words, as of a mighty marvel, and a proof not less of the power of the painter than of his deep love for her whom he depicted so surpassingly well. But at length, as the labor drew nearer to its conclusion, there were admitted none into the turret, for the painter had grown wild with the ardor of his work, and turned his eyes from canvas rarely, even to regard the countenance of his wife. And he would not see that the tints which he spread upon the canvas were drawn from the cheeks of her who sat beside him. And when many weeks had passed, and but little remained to do, save one brush upon the mouth, and one tint upon the eye, the spirit of the lady again flickered up as the flame within the socket of the lamp. And then the brush was given, and then the tint was placed, and for one moment the painter stood entranced before the work which he had wrought. But in the next, while he yet gazed, he grew tremulous and very pallid, and aghast, and crying with a loud voice, "This is indeed life itself," turned suddenly to regard his beloved. She was dead. And there we have it. That was The Oval Portrait by Edgar Allan Poe. What did you think about it? For me, this story raises more questions than it answers. Let's start at the beginning. The opening sentence is a flood of information in which we learn that the writer is desperately wounded, he's accompanied by a valet who cares enough about him to break into a chateau, and that the whole story takes place in the Apennine Mountains of Italy. We have no prior explanation or backstory, or even a name for the writer. Poe doesn't tell us how he got injured, or even why he's journeying through the Italian mountain range. Instead, Poe spends the next 20% of the story, and yes, I did do the math, but he spends that describing the chateau itself. The opening sentence labels the building as, quote, a pile of commingled gloom and grandeur, similar to the fancy of Mrs. Radcliffe. This is in reference to Anne Radcliffe, an English novelist born in the late 1700s that I consider to be the pioneer of the Gothic novel. Many people know Mary Shelley, who authored Frankenstein. She's much more commonly known, but Shelley was born in 1797, which is the same year that Radcliffe wrote her fifth novel, The Italian. So why would Poe reference Radcliffe? When I say that she pioneered the Gothic novel, I mean her stories often use the combination of near supernatural events with exotic historical settings. The abandoned chateau that the writer finds himself at fits that latter description of the exotic historical setting, and by referencing Radcliffe, Poe is hinting at the near supernatural events that we later find out take place around the creation of the oval portrait. The oval portrait is one of dozens, if not hundreds of paintings scattered around one of the chateau's apartments, in, quote, a remote turret of the building. The apartment has a bed, which holds a book that numbers and describes all of the paintings. Side note, this is one of the earliest examples of the single bed trope, where two characters are forced to share a bed because there are no others to be found. So to any fantasy romance readers that just simply adore that trope, you got this guy to thank. So be grateful. By now, Pedro the loyal valet is passed out, and our narrator stays up until midnight, reading. Do y'all remember doing that growing up? I still remember when I was 13, I stayed up until about 1 in the morning reading the second Hunger Games book. At the time, my mom thought I was a little young to be reading the series, so not only did I resort to the classic flashlight under the covers, but I also stuffed a blanket into the crack at the bottom of my door just to block as much light as I possibly could. It worked. I wasn't caught, but I was incredibly tired the next day. Still, it was worth it. Anyway, Poe's narrator is doing the 18th century equivalent of doom scrolling. Don't believe me? Listen to how Poe describes it. Quote, rapidly and gloriously the hours flew by, and the deep midnight came. End quote. In the next sentence, he mentions that the position of the light displeased him, so he went to move it. This is after spending literal hours reading with bad lighting. Think about it. How often do you scroll Instagram or TikTok while knowing in the back of your head that you need to change something about what you're currently doing? Maybe you have to use a bathroom. Maybe your posture sucks. Whatever it is, you know that it'll literally just take a minute to fix. But instead, you just keep scrolling, ignoring it for as long as possible. Personally, I feel like this is something pretty much everyone can relate to, at least in these days. So he moves the light. In doing so, he reveals the main subject of the story. And now, nearly halfway through the story, we realize why Poe titled it The Oval Portrait, instead of The Wounded Guy in the Abandoned Chateau, featuring Pedro. The entire narrative pivots toward this painting, which the narrator is only able to look at for a few seconds before closing his eyes. Even he's not sure at first why he does this, so he goes through all the possible reasons. Could he have mistaken it for a real person? No, even at a glance, he was able to see how detailed the frame was. Maybe he's an incel, and he's not used to seeing beautiful women. This actually could be true, due to the narrator's significant lack of backstory, but it's not the reason cited either. Poe tells us that he sits for about an hour thinking about it, before realizing why he had the reaction that he did. Quote, I had found the spell of the picture in an absolute lifelikeliness of expression, which at first startling, finally confounded, subdued, and appalled me. So essentially, the oval portrait is an incredibly realistic painting. So much so that not only did it jump scare the narrator, it caused him to take nearly an hour to figure out why. Now, personally, I've seen a lot of paintings before, and some of them have been pretty lifelike, but I've never spent an hour just thinking about how realistic a single painting is. This means that, between myself and the narrator, one of us is significantly smarter than the other. Honestly, though, I'm not sure which one it is. So he finally picks up the book to read the story behind the painting, and it's a tragic romance between an incredibly beautiful maiden and an incredibly talented painter. I absolutely love Poe's description here of the maiden, quote, loving and cherishing all things, hating only the art which was her rival, dreading only the palette and brushes and other untoward instruments which deprived him of the countenance of her lover, end quote. On the one hand, this woman sounds like an amazing wife. She adores her husband, and she wants him wholly and completely for her own, which in a marriage, that's a very reasonable thing to want. On the other hand, guy can't have a hobby? I saw this picture of a bride holding a sign that says, quote, I got married on a Friday, while the groom stood with all of his groomsmen holding a sign that said, quote, because Saturdays are for the boys. That sucks. I feel so bad for that bride. The whole concept of marriage is choosing one person to love and prioritize over literally everyone and everything else. In the oval portrait, however, it's not the boys or even another woman that stands in between the bride and her husband. It's art. Capitalization is one of the most fundamental rules of grammar. You use it in two instances, at the start of a sentence and for proper names. Poe describes art using a capital A. Art isn't just a hobby or a pastime for the painter. Art has a name. The painter was obsessed with it to the point where Poe describes art as being his first bride. The maiden knew this obsession and married him anyway, which causes Poe to coin another trope, specifically the I can fix him mindset. Ladies, if you're interested in a guy who's so obsessed with something that you can say with reasonable confidence that he's already married to that thing, that's a red flag. It could be sports or cars or building incredibly lifelike miniature Civil War battlefields in his basement. Whatever the case, don't go into the marriage thinking, I can fix him. Sort this thing out before the wedding. You'll save a whole lot of drama. And in the case of the oval portrait, you could even save your life. I'll make a side note here for one important exception to the rule. If you and your man are both Christians, and that man's obsession, his first love, is Jesus, marry that man. If that man loves you according to the biblical definition of a husband's love, you'll be in the best possible marriage you can have on this earth. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say on that point. Back to Poe's brutal love triangle. The devotion of this woman to her man is incredible. He talks about painting her, and Poe says that this was a terrible thing for this lady to hear. She knows he has an unhealthy obsession with art. She knows she could just say no, but she doesn't. So let's talk about her working conditions, because if OSHA had been around back then, this handbook would have been the same as this woman. Violated. She sat for many weeks in a room with only one source of light. Poe doesn't really specify whether it's an overhead window or skylight, or if it's a lantern or candle of some sort. Personally, I'd argue for the latter option for two reasons. First, the light has to be consistent enough to justify the amount of time spent in there. And second, Poe describes the light as withering the health and spirits of the bride. Lack of natural light, getting that vitamin D, that's unhealthy. This is why, generally speaking, people who go on hikes are much happier than basement-dwelling Reddit mods. On the bright side, pun intended, the bride wasn't isolated, at least not yet. People came in to see the portrait and how well the painter was doing, and presumably to bring them food and drink, give them regular updates on the football season, basic essentials for life, right? But towards the end, the painter locks the door and locks in. He's almost done, and he wants no distractions. And the way Poe describes the painter reminds me of the way Stephen King talks about writing. Quote, good writing can be simultaneously intoxicating and idea-driven. If stone-sober people can make love like they're out of their minds, can actually be out of their minds while caught in that throw, then why shouldn't writers be able to go bonkers and still stay sane? Passion leads to temporary insanity. Your logical, rational brain goes into hibernation as primal instincts take over, and the only thing you can focus on is bringing to life that concept that you have in your mind. Now, I can somewhat relate to King's quote. As a writer, I felt that passion before. That temporary insanity, when I just get in the zone, find my groove, and write 5,000 words in one day, is an incredible feeling. It's honestly super addictive. I can't really relate to the other half of the quote, as I'm very alone, but I'm sure that any viewers familiar with the ancient art of baby making can understand. Anyway, now we come to the final throes of the story, where the painter was enraptured with his work, so enraptured that he somehow missed the death of his wife who sat beside him. I think the ending does a good job of speaking for itself, so I've only a couple of points to add here. First is a payoff referencing Anne Radcliffe, the gothic genre, and the supernatural in the beginning of the story. What is more gothic than death, after all? And there are certain supernatural elements that are implied, such as in this sentence, quote, and he would not see that the tints which he spread upon the canvas were drawn from the cheeks of her who sat beside him, end quote. The more the paintings grew lifelike, the more life wilted from the bride. I love this imagery. It actually serves as the inspiration to one of my own short stories. It's called The Story Collector. It's the first video I've ever uploaded to this channel, and personally, I really like it. I'm pretty proud of it. So if you're interested, I'll link it on screen at the end of the video, which is almost here. Don't worry. The final thing I want to mention is found in the final sentence of the story, and it is, in fact, the only line of dialogue in this entire thing. And this one line is spoken by the painter upon completion of his work. And I think that reading it, like in the book, is far more powerful than hearing it aloud. So pay attention here. The painter remarks, quote, this is indeed life itself, end quote. Not only is the word life italicized to show emphasis, it's also capitalized. Remember earlier in the video when I talked about how art was given a name? Poe's nomenclature is very deliberate here. There are only 3 names in the entire story. There's Pedro, the valet. There's Art, the painter's first bride. And right at the very end, we have life. Life is named. Life comes into being in the form of this painting, while at the same time, life leaves the maiden. Now here we are, at the end of the video. I love this story, but I know my analysis really only scratched the surface of what's really going on here. There's so much depth and detail to Poe's stories, and I fully intend to cover more of his work in the future. So if there's a particular one you'd like to hear me read or talk about next, please let me know. I love to hear your thoughts, especially on the oval portrait. What stuck with you the most? What part did I get wrong in my analysis, or completely leave out? Why is Pedro the only human with a name? Tell me your thoughts, your theories, your ideas. I want to hear all of it. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. If you're interested in hearing one of my own stories, one that was inspired by Poe, then check out The Story Collector. There should be a link on the screen now. I appreciate your time, and have a great rest of your day.